And we're going to be looking at this whole idea that the biblical story is one story, but it sits amongst a number of other stories. And I'm not saying once upon a time things, I'm talking about these big cultural stories. So what other stories are there, and what other stories are shaping us? Well, we can talk about, at a global scale, there's these big picture stories. There's the Islamic story. There's the Islamic story of the world. There's the Buddhist story. We could talk about the postmodern story of the world. But what I'd like to do is talk about the one that's affecting us here the most in Australia. And that would be this dominant Western, secular, humanistic cultural story. So we could really take away these other ones, because this is the dominant cultural story that's we're living in. Would you agree?
Yep.
But we can also say that there's another story, and that's the biblical story that we've been looking at this morning. And this biblical story, the story of creation and God dealing with his people, even though they're broken, he's dealing with them in a way that's pointing them towards the resurrection and the redemption of all things in Christ, and ultimately a new creation. That biblical story I've drawn sitting up on top of the other story. Why? Because it is the true story. Now, I've also deliberately drawn them at an intersection with each other, because at many points they are at tension with each other. Sure, there are some common elements to those two stories. But many times, and certainly as we go about the task of Christian education, there are many times in which we note there's a great tension between the two. Have you ever heard some people refer to, and it's a bit of a soapbox of mine to get upset about this, but talking about this other cultural story as the real world? You sometimes might hear it said in a staff meeting in a Christian school. Yes, but we've got to make sure we're preparing the kids for the real world. No, surely this is the real world. This is the true story of life that God has created for us to live in and out of that story. And just to highlight again, we want to talk about how to deal with this tension, because that is where we find ourselves when we have a classroom of kids, we have a community of learners, and we want to actually unfold for them God's world. We find many tensions between the cultural story they live in and the true story of the world. Well, how do we get rid of that tension then? Well, one way to get rid of the tension, you remember the definition of parallel lines? What are they? Two lines that never meet. Easy. We've got rid of the tension, haven't we? We've pulled those two stories apart, make them parallel to each other, they never meet, no tension, we're all happy. But there's a few problems with doing that, isn't there? Hopefully you're seeing that that's obvious. I think let's explore three of the concerns that can arise from that. One is that we might say, okay, well, we're going to live entirely in the biblical story. This other story is bad, it's evil, it's wrong. We'll shut it out. We'll build our walls around it. We'll push it out. We won't participate in it. We won't engage with it. We'll just live in this story here. Now, many Christian schools, particularly in the past, have taken that approach, where they've shut the world out and it's become a little enclave. That's not actually healthy, is it? In many ways. So that's one trap I think you can fall into with this forcing of the two stories apart. And the other one is, and you'll know people that fit into this sort of a story, that they've had a Christian upbringing and may have even gone to a Christian school, but when they hit the workforce or university, they've been taught to think in kind of parallel storylines for their lives. So they get to university or the workforce, and increasingly this biblical story seems less relevant to them. And it becomes irrelevant to the point that they just one day set it free, let it wander off. And they live entirely in this story, out of this storyline. And you will all know people that fit into that category as well. Now, that's not ideal either, obviously. But I think there's a third option, which I think is, well, it's maybe even more dangerous because it's more subtle. And that is this. What have I done? I've gone and I've placed one foot in both camps, in a sense. What I'm saying here is that I'm going to allow some aspects of my life to be shaped by this story. I'm a good Christian, I'm a faithful believer in God. Yeah, of course, I'll let that story shape a number of aspects of my life, but I'll let this storyline shape some other aspects. So it raises the questions of, so which story are you going to allow to shape the aspirations that you have for your children, for example? Not just your students, if you're a teacher here, but also for your kids. What storyline will shape the aspirations that you have for them? What about what is a good investment of my time and money? Which storyline are we going to allow to shape how we define a good investment? Lots of stuff in the media we hear about investing. But which storyline will we allow to shape what a good investment is? What about my understanding of myself, who I am, my self-understanding, my self-worth, my self-esteem, whichever phrase you want to use? Which storyline am I going to allow to shape my view of myself? And I'm sure that if any of you know even one teenager, you'll know that this storyline here has an amazingly strong influence on their defining understanding of who they are and their place within the world and so on. But there is another story that we can allow to shape that view, that understanding. But when we live with one foot placed in both camps, we allow some aspects of the biblical story to be shaped by that, aspects of our lives to be shaped by the biblical story, like our prayer lives and our moral life and our church life. But the other story to shape other aspects, then what we're doing is we're living dualistically, is a phrase that's often used. We can talk about this as dualism. A dualistic way of seeing the world, a parallel way of seeing the world.